Welcome to another episode of the Assemble Performance Podcast. Today, we're going to be going over a shorter podcast on why you need carbs, why they're important, whether you're looking to lose body fat or push performance in strength, endurance, or hybrid training. So, I've got some notes up here. That way, we can be organized. We'll try not to be looking at them too much, but that's what we're going to get into today. Now, this question comes because I have a lot of conversations with people that ask me about carbs and fueling, and I just made a new fueling guide as well. So I wanted to put this out that way people had another source of free information on fueling and why carbs are important. I think the narrative around carbs being completely bad is shifting away, but there are still the carnivore bros, right, that say you don't need carbs, and I've seen it harm athletes in their performance and how they feel about things, and obviously even their health. So I would like to talk about that today. So before we get into why you need carbs, we have to understand what a carb is. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but we have to understand what a carb is. That way we all know what we're talking about. So a carb is one of the main macronutrients. You have proteins, fats, carbs, and then alcohol is added in there as well sometimes. And a carb would be any fiber, starch, or vegetables. So some examples would be fruit, grains, vegetables. Sorry, I misspoke. A carb would be fiber, starch, or sugar. And an example would be fruits, grains, or vegetables, right? So fibers, starches, and sugars, which everybody says sugars are bad, right? But carbs would be our body's main source of fuel. So we're going to get into that a little bit, but just know that carbs are our body's main source of fuel. So now that we've determined that a carb is one of these things we just said, now that we've defined carbs, we can go into why we need them. If you want to go deeper, I invite you to get a nutrition degree or take a long nutrition course, but that's not what this is. This is focused on action for athletes and people who are just looking to improve their health and lose body fat or just be, performant. So in order to understand why we need carbs, we have to first understand how our bodies use energy. So now that we know what a carb is, we have to understand how our bodies use energy. So if you go back to high school science, right, the law of conservation of energy states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It only changes forms. So the energy that we use to move our hands, to run races, to lift weights is not coming from nowhere. It's being transformed from somewhere else. It changes from one form or another. And we need to understand high level how that happens. That way we can understand why we need carbs. So one example that's not related to your body would be gas in your car. So when you fill up your car with gas, the fuel in your car has chemical energy in it. When the spark plug ignites the gas, or if you have a diesel, when the pressure ignites the gas, that chemical energy is converted into thermal energy, and that thermal energy causes the gases to expand in the piston or in the engine and push the pistons. And this motion is then transformed into mechanical energy and heat energy. So the mechanical energy moves the car forward, and there's also heat that is created then as a byproduct of that. And so in that way, you're not creating any energy, you're taking chemical energy and turning it into mechanical energy and heat. Likewise, our bodies don't create energy directly from the food we eat. It needs to be transformed into some form or way to turn that energy into activity to power muscle contraction and cellular function. And, even something as simple as moving your eye, moving your finger, that all requires energy, let alone going to do an athletic event. And so really understanding this is key to understanding why we need carbs and why we need to fuel the way we do in a way, right? Again, this is going to be a 10,000 foot view. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty. We're discussing energy systems and metabolism, and people literally get PhDs in this topic. So we're not going to go super in depth, just focus on action. But we need to understand, how does that food that we eat get turned into energy for our bodies to use? And it does this through something called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. I have it here on my arm, if you can see, because I'm a nerd like that. But ATP would be the energy currency of our body, is the way I like to explain it. And I think textbooks explain it that way. It's how the energy in our food is converted into a usable form for energy. So just like you go to work, you exchange your time for money, and then you use that money to buy things, to live, to do whatever. ATP is the thing that you eat food that gets turned in for ATP basically. And then the ATP gets used for energy. Again, very high level. You can get very in the weeds, but that's a basic overview of what happens. The ATP is what's used for energy. So everything we eat is either used to rebuild or repair in the sense of protein, or to power cellular function and movement in the form of more ATP. And fats are used for like hormone regulation and stuff. So as carbs are our main source of energy, I want to get into how those are turned into energy first. So when you eat carbs, they're broken down in your digestive system and then absorbed into the bloodstream as glucose or blood sugar. And your body then releases insulin, which directs that glucose into your cells for energy. In the cells, that glucose is used to resynthesize or make more ATP, which is then used to power every function in our bodies. If you have extra glucose, your body's going to store it in your muscles or your liver for later use. And then once you max out the glucose storage in those places, your body converts extra glucose to fat. Now, that's the facts, very fast overview, but that's the facts of how it works. I'm sure some of you have already started to have an emotional response to that based on your background with carbs, or your friend's background with carbs, but that's just the facts of how it works. And so now we're going to start to talk about some of the other macronutrients because a lot of you might be asking, my friend cut out carbs and they were still able to live. So clearly you can make energy from things other than carbs. And that's true. We're going to talk about that now. Our bodies can also make more ATP from fat, but it is a slower process called beta oxidation. It's more efficient, but it's slower. And because that process of converting fat into ATP takes longer than turning carbs and glucose into ATP, it's typically used during longer, lower intensity activities. Unlike carbs, fat provides a more sustained source of energy, but it's not as readily available as glucose. And that means that it's going to be slower. That's basically what that means. And your body is constantly balancing the different fuel sources based on your activity level, diet, and availability of nutrients and the type of activity you're doing. So it's not like, oh, I'm only using fat, oh, I'm only using carbs. It's always going to be a mix outside of not having any fat to turn into ATP, which would be a bigger problem than just ATP production, right? And then if needed, our bodies can also turn proteins into glucose to be used for energy via a process called gluconeogenesis. But this is something we definitely want to minimize because this takes protein from its job that we really want it to do, which is to build and repair muscle, and it turns it into being used for energy. It's a less efficient process than using glucose for energy. And it's also taking protein from what we want it to do. The reason people say to eat your protein is because we need to rebuild and repair lean muscle mass and keep our lean muscle mass. So eating carbs is known to be protein sparing. And this is why it's known to be protein sparing, because by eating enough carbohydrates, you have enough fuel to fuel your body for activity. And then the protein can go off and be used for what it's needed for. So carbs are also very important if you're trying to keep your lean muscle mass on, because you need that protein to go to where it's supposed to. So now that we understand, this is the high level overview of how carbs get turned into energy and fats and protein, then we can start to look at, all right, now when we start to manipulate each of these things, what happens? So when we're in a calorie deficit, I want to talk about that because a lot of people are in a calorie deficit. I'm in a calorie deficit right now. A calorie deficit, for those of you that might not be familiar with the term, occurs when you consume fewer calories than your body needs to maintain its current weight. When you do that, your body compensates by using stored energy like fat to make up for the shortfall, which leads to weight loss over time. And this is a weight loss journey. Your body starts to break into the fat stores that you have and the lean muscle mass stores to fuel your energy, and then you lose weight. It's important to note that a calorie deficit can affect different athletes in different ways based on your training, your goals, and how large the deficit is. Like I mentioned, when calorie intake is too low for too long, your body may start to break down muscle tissue as well as fat. And that's something that's going to happen anyways to a small extent. But if the deficit is way too large for too long, then that's going to happen to a larger amount. And we want to minimize that as much as possible when we're losing fat, because lean muscle mass is hard to earn and hard to keep as you age. So you have to be cautious of the size of the deficit. So when you're in a deficit, this isn't a calorie podcast, but when you're in a deficit, there's a few things to keep in mind. Lower energy levels, reduced strength output, potential loss of muscle mass, like I just mentioned, risk of underfueling, especially for endurance athletes, risk of performance declines, mental and emotional burnout, and increased risk of injury. That's for strength, endurance, and hybrid athletes. All those things are things that you need to keep in mind. So the key when you're in a deficit is to create a calorie deficit that's sustainable and doesn't compromise performance. And so my recommendations, just very quick, is to keep the deficit moderate, keep high protein because we want to keep that lean muscle mass on, and make sure you're timing your nutrients around your workouts, which we'll talk about when it comes to carbs. If you are on a calorie controlled diet, which means your carbs are probably a little lower if you're prioritizing protein. So we'll talk about that. So some of you might be asking, why are carbs important in a deficit if I'm burning fat, right? I just mentioned you're going to be burning fat. So why do I need to eat carbs if I'm in a deficit? If you want to maintain muscle mass and performance while you're in a deficit, you absolutely still need to eat carbs because they're our body's main fuel source. And making sure you're eating enough carbs, even in the deficit, will maximize the amount of protein your body will use to build and repair and maintain lean muscle mass. Like we already said, carbs are protein sparing. And if you're in a deficit, like I mentioned, it can be useful to time those carbs around your training sessions to make sure that you are as fueled as possible for the session. So if you train in the morning, eating more carbs in the morning. If you train in the afternoon, timing your carbs out throughout the beginning of the day to peak before your activity. That way you have as much glucose as possible to fuel your activity, and then you can have a little less carbs later in the day, right? And then why are carbs important for performance? This is a question that I've gotten a lot on Instagram and leading from the deficit just in performance in general. Why do we want carbs? So I'm trying to avoid going too in the weeds in this. I do have some YouTube videos that go way more in the weeds, but for higher intensity activities like strength training or speed work, muscle glycogen and blood glucose are the main fuel sources used. It's readily available to replenish ATP. And so by eating enough carbs on a day-to-day basis, we're able to maximize the amount of blood glucose, but really muscle glycogen stored. That way we can use that for energy. And for endurance events, some of you that were listening may have caught on to the fact that I said fat is used more as an energy source during endurance events. So why do endurance athletes eat a lot of carbs? This is a really big one. And the reason is really because they're more readily available and they're easier on the GI tract. So once you get to a 60 to 90 plus minute activity, you really need to start taking on some carbs to not only fuel your session, but also fuel your recovery afterwards. And again, the reason for that is because carbs are more quickly digested and used for energy, so they're going to be more readily available while you're training. And eating high fat would slow digestion down and could cause GI distress. Before endurance races, the recommendation from me and from a lot of other coaches is to minimize fat and fiber the day before, especially at dinner. Not because that's the healthiest thing to do from a long-term health perspective, but because you're going to be minimizing GI distress before your activity the next day. So if you need carbs while you're training, then you might be asking how many carbs should I eat? So the amount, like I have mentioned in previous videos, is going to depend on how long your session is going to be. So for example, if you have a 1 to 2 hour session, at 1 hour, you might not even need carbs. But as you start to push longer, you're looking at 30 to 60 grams of carbs per hour, depending on the size of the athlete. So I'm a bigger person. I take on more carbs because it's impossible for me to eat back all the carbs I burn. So for 1 to 2 hours, you're looking at 30 to 60 grams of carbs per hour. Once you start to push 2 to 3 hours, you're looking at 30 to 90 grams of carbs per hour. So wherever you sit in that range comfortably, 90 grams per hour is a larger amount. And depending on what you do, you might not be able to take that on, right? So when I run, I have a hard time taking on that many grams of carbs, but when I'm on the bike, it's pretty easy. There's not sloshing, so I can do that. And then when you start to push 3+ hour long events, you really want to go for a minimum of 60 to even 90 plus grams of carbs per hour, whatever you can handle. The longer the session, the more you'll need. So if you're doing an ultra marathon, you'll definitely need more carbs than if you're just doing, say, just doing a 3 hour event. It's still a long event, but eating carbs during training is going to be important for your recovery afterwards and also your performance during. So after you finish the event, you also need to be refeeding carbs and proteins. So I personally shoot for 1 to 1.2 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight right after the session. So for me, I weigh like 97 kilos right now. I'm a little bigger right now. So that's around 100 grams of carbs I'm shooting for, which is a good amount. I typically have 2 things of chocolate milk and like a banana or something, right? That tends to work out well from the gas station. But really, refeeding as much as possible afterwards is going to help you feel better later. I'm sure if you're an endurance athlete, you are very familiar with the feeling after a long endurance session of just having to sit on the couch all day, feeling awful, not being able to think, getting up and being lightheaded. It's because you didn't fuel properly enough in your session or didn't refeed enough afterwards. And so I did that for a long time. I ate plenty in my session, but I didn't refeed enough right afterwards of carbs and protein right afterwards. So carbs are especially important for that. So I've kind of gone through this fairly quickly. So again, I said this was going to be faster, but there's probably still a few of you that are asking some questions about carbs, and I want to touch on those a little bit. I hope I had some people on Instagram give me some questions, and so I hope I've answered a lot of those so far. I think I have. I tried to take all of those questions into account when I made my little outline here. But there is kind of the elephant in the room, and maybe I should have talked about this sooner because maybe I've lost some people that would have asked it, but I really want to talk about it. And that is, what about my friend who cut out carbs and lost a ton of weight? My friend, they were overweight for years and they decided to cut out carbs and they lost a ton of weight. but you're telling me carbs are important, but they're telling me carbs are the devil, right? They're telling me carbs are awful and I cannot have them. So, we all know somebody who's done this and it's not bad. They got results and that's great. And I want to celebrate that. It worked, right? So I'm not going to discount that it worked, but I want to explain why it worked. And I want to explain why you don't have to also cut out carbs to get this to work, right? So carbs are not the enemy. And I just want you to know that. So, firstly, when you cut out a whole macronutrient like carbohydrates, you're going to decrease your calories. Even if you eat more protein and fat, your calories are most likely going to decrease. And cutting out carbs is also going to cut out a lot of the hyperpalatable foods that are easy to overeat. So it's not that carbs are bad, it's that these hyperpalatable foods taste really good. They don't fill you up that much. And so you can more easily eat a lot of them. And that is going to be detrimental to your weight. And so if you cut out carbs, you all of a sudden can't eat those. You also can't eat the pasta and the oats and all the real healthy carbs. But by cutting out carbs, you're also not eating those hyperpalatable foods and your calories are going to be down. That's number one. If you're going to be in a calorie deficit, you're going to lose weight, no matter if you cut out carbs or if you do it with a balanced diet. Number two, which I've spoken about this before, is that every gram of glucose that your body stores also stores around 3 grams of water with it. And so if you're going to be in a calorie deficit, you're going to deplete some of that glycogen and glucose, and you're going to also lose a lot of weight. But that weight is going to be 3 parts water, right? Or 3 grams of water for every gram of glucose, right? So a good amount of that is water weight. So the scale looks great. Maybe you look great because you're shed water weight, but is that really losing what you want, right? Did you lose the body fat? Is that what you were shooting for? Was just a weight on a scale? Because that's kind of empty. You really have to ask yourself, did I lose the weight I want to lose? And when you put carbs back in, that's going to come right back up. And it's not because carbs are evil or water weight is evil. Water weight is essential. We're mostly water. And the only time you should really be cutting water weight is if you're prepping for a bodybuilding show or to make a weight class. And even then, making weight classes for fights, it's not healthy. You know it's not healthy. Even bodybuilders, when they get down to that level, it's not healthy. And that's why they're only there for a short amount of time. So I hope that quick podcast gave you a little information on carbs. If you would like more information, I will link an Instagram post actually in the description. And that Instagram post will give you my fueling guide. So that'll give you the instructions on how to get to my fueling guide. That goes a little bit more in detail on this. It's I would say a good amount more detail on this. And it is more, you can take it at your own pace. And I was kind of quick because I have a few calls that I have to get on, but I really wanted to get this recorded. So I appreciate everybody that submitted questions. If I did not answer your question, send me a DM on Instagram or an email, justin@assembleperformance.com. That'll be in the description. I would be happy to do a longer podcast on carbs, but I really just wanted to get this out there for people who think that carbs need to be demonized or who worry about, am I eating enough for my activity? I want to lose body fat. Do I need to cut carbs out? I really just wanted to dispel a lot of myths and give you some information there and some analogies to use. So I hope you found that helpful. If you did, share with a friend who would also find it helpful. If you didn't, then don't tell a soul, right? I'm just kidding. You can let me know. I want to put out more of what you guys want to see. So yeah, like, subscribe, leave a comment, rating, and review. Helps me reach more people, helps me put out more awesome content that is going to help more athletes and more people around the world. So with that said, I will see you in the next episode of the Assemble Performance Podcast.